Is it worth paying to live in those suburbs versus paying a lower price potentially to live outside the suburbs and sending your kids to a private school and paying that money to the private school instead of paying it to your loan interest? Which way do you go and which way might be better financially? When we start to look at property value growth in these suburbs, and by looking at the change in the median house price of each over the last 10 years and 20 years, what I found interesting is that we can't draw any major conclusions to say that you would have been better off living in there. When we look at the typical cost to send your child to private school, top tier private schools are around $25,000 to $30,000 a year to send your kids there. When we look at current interest rates being around 5.5%, that would give you the ability to repay an additional loan per year between $450,000 and $550,000. When we look at all of these factors, seeking out the public schools both as a homeowner and investor, it might not be the only factor that contributes to growth. When we do our trifecta review, it's one of the factors that we consider for the area. And we see quite starkly that a property that's one side of the catchment versus the other. I'm taking a deep dive into the top 6 crime hotspots around Perth, and I'm going to examine, does it affect growth? Does it affect rental yield? And is it worth considering when we're deciding where to invest? And certainly it's got to be worth considering where we're going to live. Looking through this list of 21 regions, any guesses as to what's performed the best over the last 10 years by change in median growth rate? It was none other than Kwinana. Mandurah has had a huge comeback over the last 5 years. It's done an impressive 68.3% increase over the last 10 years, but it did go down the toilet massively. You'd have to wonder when we were going to get a Western Suburbs top performing region in. It's done 65.7% growth over the last 10 years, and that's really interesting because those regions, those suburbs within there are going to have a really strong kick as we round out our cycle.
Welcome to Perth Property Insider, where you will learn how to grow your wealth and improve your life using Perth property. Our show is brought to you by Investors Edge Real Estate, the highly rated and award-winning property management, sales and buyers agency servicing the whole of Perth.
Now let's take a look at the top 10 public schools, and this is based on the Better Education ranking system, and by no means it's the only measure of quality of schools, but it's certainly one that I'd say a majority of people look at. And for the purpose of today's podcast, I'm just focusing on the top 10. I'm sure if you're looking at the top 20, top 30, top 40 schools, they're all going to be of a certain high quality compared to if you're comparing something that's at the bottom end of the list. So relative comparisons are important, and you might not be able to discern a school in the top 10 versus a school in the top 20 or top 30. So keep that in mind. Now, when we look at the list, Perth Mod is at the top. That's an inner city area school, and that's consistently at the top of the school rankings. I believe it's not accessible through catchment purely, so I won't really put too much analysis around that. I believe it's through application, and they accept outstanding students in a variety of different modalities, so I don't believe that's a catchment-based school. But then when we look at the rest of the top 10, we've got Willetton at number 2, Rossmoyne at number 3, Shenton College at number 4, then got Applecross at 5, John Curtin College in Freo at 6. We've got Mount Lawley Senior High at 7, Churchlands at 8, which is in the western suburbs, Leeming at 9, and Melville at 10. So when I look through this list and see where the locations are based, it's interesting to note that 6 of these schools are in the inner south of the river. And that's where the majority of these top 10 are. When I'm talking about those six, I'm referring to Leeming, Melville, John Curtin, Freo, Applecross, Rossmoyne, and Willerton. So a real high concentration of schools in that inner south there, and you can almost live in any suburb in that inner south and go to a great public school. So I ask myself, has that come about because the western suburbs has mainly got private schools, which it does? So therefore, they're not appearing in this list. And of course, any quality private school, I'm not talking about appearing in this list either, not just western suburbs ones. Two of these schools were based in the western suburbs, Churchlands and Shenton College. So you'd kind of expect with the dollars and extra resources available in those areas that they'd be supportive of more quality education potentially. Two of these were the inner schools, which I mentioned was Perth Mod and Mount Lawley. So Mount Lawley's consistently sort of been in that top 10 for a long time, and it's relatively easy to get to for a lot of those inner north suburbs. So really that's probably the only suburbs that is on the north, but it's still, I would call, more of an inner school. And interestingly, that left no real northern-based public schools in the top 10. So come on, North, what's going on? When we look at the typical cost to send your child to private school, top tier private schools are around $25,000 to $30,000 a year to send your kids there. When we look at current interest rates being around 5.5%, that would actually give you the ability to repay an additional loan per year between 450 and 550,000. So if you've got multiple kids going there at the same time, that could potentially be anywhere from $1 million to $1.5 million of extra borrowing that you could afford just on the private school fees that you'd save alone to send your kids to the public school instead. So very worth considering seeking out these catchments just purely from a saving point of view of what you won't spend on private school fees you can put into your house. And those figures I've quoted is for interest only loan, so you will have a bit of extra principal to pay if you're making principal repayments. So keep that in mind as well. Now, when we look at all of these factors, seeking out the public schools, both as a homeowner and investor, while it might not be the only factor that contributes to growth, when we do our trifecta review, it's one of the factors that we definitely consider for the area. And we see quite starkly that a property that's one side of the catchment versus the other, when we look at individual property growth rates, not talking suburb level, but we're talking property level now, can be starkly different. And so we're always looking to buy into a school zone that is better for the area if we had the choice. So let me take you through the top crime hotspots one by one, and we'll see what the data reveals and how it can inform our investing and home buying decisions. I thought it was pretty interesting to note that of the 6 hotspot suburbs, the actual crime rate was rising in all of them except one where it was trending sideways, but still it was extremely high. The top crime suburb in Perth, it may not come as a surprise to some, was actually Northbridge. So it's the one that is trending sideways, but is still one of the highest crime suburbs in the whole of Perth, the highest that I could find by the data I got a hold of. Very high crime rate per capita of living there because it's got a lot of transient people that are in and out. It's got a lot of backpackers. It's got a lot of nightlife that comes and inflates on the weekend. So maybe part of its crime stats, when we look at number of overall crimes per 1,000 people, it had a whopping 2,075 crimes per 1,000 people per year. So seems like a hell of a lot. It is, but it maybe we shouldn't compare it to the number of residences there solely because there's a lot of that influx. The top crime in the area was actually drug dealing and trafficking, which was 712 crimes over the last year, followed by theft with 6,000 crimes over the last year. So it does seem like the police are cracking down on the drug taking, which is good. I guess, how do you know about a crime if they're not making an arrest? So I don't know if they're reporting on every other crime that's going on unless it's being reported. So that's a positive. And when we look at the type of housing that's in Northbridge, it's mainly the unit market. So we're talking about a 535,000 median price. You're getting around a 7% rental yield there now, which is very high on the rental yield side. And when we look at how the growth for units has been in the last year, there's been a 12 odd percent growth. The last 3 years, 24% growth. Last 5 years, 29% growth. In the last 10 years, it's had a total rather of 4% growth, not an average, a total of 4%. So that 10-year growth figure, not in terms of total growth, 4%, really shows how far down the toilet Northbridge went when the market was down here. And it still has not really fully recovered. Could that be an opportunity? I'm not going to stake my reputation on it. But what I do know is that there's some big stigmas associated with the lifestyle of living in Northbridge. This does translate through to higher tenant turnover. And a part of that higher tenant turnover is also because there's a lot of transient renters. So people coming in that are either students or first time in the state, they might didn't just find somewhere close to Perth because they don't know where to rent yet. Start out there, decide that, set their horizons on a suburb or somewhere further out, and then make their move to somewhere better. There's a lot of furnished apartments in there as well. So people come in, they don't actually have furniture. There's a lot of companies that put people up. So transient renters may also lead to that turnover, not purely, down to the noise factors or the crime in the area, but it certainly contributes to the overall less desirability to live in Northbridge. And when we look at how that unit growth compares to other units, it's certainly very low. And if you were going to buy a unit, you could do way, way better. And it's undeniable that the crime is having an overall effect on that desirability. So on the positive side, what you do get in Northbridge if you're an investor is that risk factor getting priced in. So there's not too many suburbs in Perth that would have a typical rental yield of 7% for units. So very high rental yields, and it's definitely going to be needed to counter the risk. And the main risk is that when times are tough, when the market goes cooler, when we don't have a high population growth, areas that are less desirable, such as Northbridge, are going to be much harder to rent and find a tenant, much harder to sell and find a buyer. So they do, when the Perth market tide raises, as we've had in the last 3 to 4 years, you can see that you've still got a 23% growth in the last 3 years, 29% in the last 5 years. Hasn't really done much in the last 5, more in the last 3. And especially in the last year, that's an increasing trend with 12%. So it's playing a little bit of catch up. But when the tide goes out, this is the kind of place with the kind of property that you're going to struggle with. So don't look to sell, but hope that you have long-term tenants because it can be harder to rent in those sort of times. Now, the next suburb hotspot for crime, what do you reckon it's going to be? It's Midland. And crime has been rising steadily there over the last 5 years, especially for violent offences. Be careful when you go into Midland to do your shopping. There's been 544 crimes per 1,000 people there over the last year. And theft tops the list of crimes there with 1,656 thefts over the last year. So people like to rob and steal in Midland. You're getting a typical median house price there of about 600K now. And when we look at what's happened, we've seen houses grow by 22% over the last year, 83% over the last 3 years. 118% over the last 5 years, and we're up 45% over the last 10 years. So did go down the toilet a fair bit as well, only 45% up over the last 10 years. Still arguably very affordable to get in there. So could see some more upside ahead. And when we look at the yield there that you can typically get for a house, it'd likely be around 5%. So you are getting a bit stronger rental yield to account for the extra risk. And what's really the tale of Midland at the moment is that with the backdrop of higher interest rates, with the backdrop of rising and inflating prices of everything, the struggle of families to afford things, buyers have definitely been more focused on affordability the last 3 years rather than safety. But that 10-year growth is the tale of what can happen when things cool off and how quiet things get and how much more difficult and it could be to sell and rent there. I remember how challenging it was across 2016 to 19. Midland went into a dark coma, you could call it, and it was very tough in there to rent and sell properties. So good time now to think about getting out if you are going to sell in these types of crime, heavy crime, lower socioeconomic suburbs, because when people are more focused on affordability, that's going to drive the demand and that will subside at some point in the future. Still got a bit of runway, I think, but just think about your position if you are not going to hold it longer term. Next suburb in my top 6 crime hotspots is Cannington. So it has had 519 crimes per 1,000 people there. Theft tops the list with 1,899 total over the last year. It's really up there. It's got the train station, it's got Westfield, and it's got a lot of transient foot traffic that comes out of both of those. And that, I think, is a tribute, really increases the crime to surrounding areas. So we've got about a 688,000 median house price or typical sort of price over the last year. Cannington's definitely been a bit of the forgotten cousin of the lower prices. It's still relatively affordable compared to many others that are as close as Cannington is to the city. You almost can't pinpoint exactly what has held Cannington back, and this could be it. While we can't say for certain, it's definitely showed up in the growth rates when we compare it. It's had 14.9% over the last year, 44% in the last 3 years, 64% over the last 5 years. And when we look longer term, it's had 44% over the last 10 years. So when we compare that to other suburbs, you could definitely have done way better. And you're not getting that fabulous, you're getting a reasonable yield in there at 5.2%. But when we look at just how poorly it's sort of performed on the growth side, the rental yield's not enough compensation, I think, for the lackluster growth that's been there. But all things sort of even out a bit, and I think there will be some upside before the end of this cycle. I haven't looked at what's predicted yet, but I think it does seem undervalued and the gap does seem to be getting wider compared to some of the surrounding suburbs there now. Again, you have to ask yourself over what time period you're looking to get into a property, and I'm never focused on the shorter term. So it never appeals for me to go in and get an uptick and then try to sell out. So it's not a suburb that I would be considering because of its medium and longer term factors. So it's certainly got its challenges there with crime. That's definitely clear.
Just real quick before we continue on with the episode, are you getting my email updates yet? If you're not, you're missing out on our suburb intelligence reports, which we tailor and prepare for your individual suburbs of interest, showing advanced stats and insights. Must get onto those. And I also send out exclusive invitations to our events, including webinars, sundowners, and workshops. So if you're not getting those, head on over to investorsedge.com.au/join and make sure you're receiving my email updates.
I want to now look at the top 5 suburbs for growth over the 10 years. I'll round out the top 10 just to see what the overall sort of flavor is to them and if there's any common themes. And then again, I'm going to touch on the bottom performers, see whether their position there is justified, see what some of the reasons might be, and see whether they might be undervalued and represent a good opportunity for you to look deeper at them for the coming decade. So, top five suburbs. The top suburb. Any guesses? Do you think it's a lower end suburb? Do you think it's a middle? Do you think it's a top higher price suburb? It's actually Trig with a median house price of 2.3 million. Its 10-year growth has been 115%. Now that's just must be purely based on the quality of that seaside suburb and how popular it's been. 115% change over 10 years. Over 20 years, it's done a massive 290% change. So keep in mind that's more than any single other suburb across the whole of Perth. I'm talking in 10-year total growth, more than Kwinana, more than Armidale areas. This is the top suburb, 115%. Very impressive indeed. So quality definitely trumps there, and you'd have to think by the end of this cycle, it's probably still going to be up there because the upper end has still got more to go and more to round out in the cycle. We next had Bouvard, which definitely ties into the story I was telling you earlier about Mandurah going down the toilet and then having a big comeback because the 10-year growth rate is massive at 114%, but the 20-year was only 135%. So for the previous 10 years, it only done 15 odd percent over a 10-year period. It was diabolically bad. So certainly had some catch-up growth. Probably won't ride the same roller coaster, but that was the suburb that most contributed to Mandurah being in the top five submarkets. Then when we look to other individual suburbs that were in this top five, we had Jolimont, another high-end area with 1.9 mil median price, had done 105% growth. We had Applecross with 2.78 mil median and Shenton Park with 2.2. So quality has really still held up over this 10-year period. As I mentioned, I'm thinking there's a lot more to be had here still too. So just goes to show that I know a lot of the hype and a lot of the attention, especially in the short term and over this 5-year period, has been towards the bottom end suburbs. There's been all kinds of stuff in very well-known investors, other podcast hosts talking about, hey, you don't have to, you can still get long-term great growth in low-end areas. I beg to differ that like quality over the long term still trumps. And yes, if you can't afford to buy quality for the long term, you can still do well with suburb selection and choosing best suburb that you can afford and the best suburb within that. And selection does play certainly a very important role, but this definitely motivates me to try to get into more quality, higher end price points just because of when I see how impressive these growth figures are and we haven't even rounded out our cycle. Now, other suburbs to round out the top 10. Are they all high price suburbs? No, they're not. We've got Marmion with 1.8. That's a high price suburb. But then we've got Hillman, which is a suburb of Rockingham. That's got a 615k median. That's really been a big part of Rockingham's submarket growth, pushing that up. We had Medina, which was one of the Kwinana suburbs in there at spot 8. We then had Darlington, which is a hill suburb, often overlooked, but has done very well over the 10-year period. And we've then got Camillo, which was in the city of Armidale and had a crazy level of growth over the 10-year period. Still has done very well over the 20-year period. Arguably changed a lot, transformed a lot, but also probably had a lot of its growth that it's going to be a bit more subdued now. So let's now go down the list, down, and we're going to go to the worst performing suburbs and see what they've got in common. Are any of them due for a comeback? So when we look at the top 10, the very worst performing suburb over a 10-year period of looking at median sale price changes was Vivash. It's a often overlooked, unknown suburb that's out next to Midland. Any one time, it can be hard to sell there, especially in the down market, because people often don't search. It's only had 13.7% growth over a 10-year period. And over 20 years, it hasn't done very well at all either, 133.9% growth. I think it'll have some comeback, but I wouldn't necessarily be betting on it for the long term either. Next area was East Perth, and it's just never really broken out. And it's crazy because of how close to Perth it is, how great the amenities are with the cove in there, the cafes, all the rest of it. Look, it might have some decent catch-up growth in the shorter term. It's done just 19% growth in the last 10 years. But over the 20-year period, it's done even less than Vivash. It's done 129.7%. So due for some catch-up, but compared to the long-term growth, it's not substantiating to me for it to have a really strong comeback over the medium to long term. So probably not the one to invest in either for the medium or long term, maybe for the short term, but I'd prefer not be. That's more speculation and should never invest with those timeframes in mind as far as I'm concerned. Now, then we've got some real opportunities here. We've got Jundana. There is absolutely no way that should be on the third lowest over a 10-year period with just 21.7% growth. Why? It's such a quality location still. It's the median house price is 992,000. That seems so cheap for a house compared to some of the other areas. It was in City of Stirling that had relatively underperformed in the submarkets that I discussed earlier. Over 20 years, it has performed very well still with 210% growth. So that for me is a real outlier that it should come back strongly. We've then got a few other suburbs here that are the next on the list is Hazelmere. So that's got an 843k median house price. It's in the city of Swan. It's relatively underperformed with just 21.8%. And over the 20-year period, it's done 237%. So it should have some catch-up growth. Arguably, it's fairly high price for what it is, though. I don't know if I wouldn't be necessarily choosing that over a Jundana, which location to Perth wise is just so handy and so good and it's got such good amenities, whereas Hazelmere is still relatively far out, City of Swan Way. Next area was Ascot. So that was the fifth worst. It had done pretty well over the 20-year period. But I don't know, a bit of the story of Ascot, it's kind of never lived up to that initial potential that saw it surge. And it could have been like a river inland Hillaries or something. Or what they could have done with it amenity-wise could have been so much better than what it is. It has improved a lot in the last 5 years. I think it's got some shorter term gains to be had just because of how close to Perth it is and how much it's underperformed with just 24.3% over the last 10 years. I'm still on the fence about whether it's justified for the medium to long term just based on these stats. I'm not talking our trifecta method or anything else that we use to analyze areas. I'm just purely looking at underperformance over these periods, okay? So then we get to, that's our top 5 worst. We then got a few other suburbs here that I'd stay away from. At number 6 and 7, we've got Carrawarra and we've got Hilbert, which is part of Armidale. Both have had relatively low 10-year and 20-year performances, so I wouldn't necessarily think that either of them are undervalued. They might do some catch up in the short term, but medium to longer term, I wouldn't bet on them. We've got O'Connor, though, which is in Fremantle Way. That's done 28% over the last 10 years, but has still done a very respectable over 20. Over 20 years, done 199%. So that's, to me, seems like a relatively undervalued bet. I mean, you look at the median house price there, 755, seems very low for what it is and could be a good opportunity to get in there. And then the final two rounding out the bottom 10 was Bentley and Cannington, and they came up in my sub-markets that were undervalued. Belmont was not at number 12, just out of interest. So Bentley and Cannington, they've both done around 29% growth over the last 10 years. They've both performed not outstandingly well over 20 years. So that was over the last 10 years. Over 20 years, they've both done 172 and 174%. So they haven't set the world on fire, but they still seem very undervalued compared to what they've done over 20 years. So I think some good opportunity there, especially if you don't have a big budget. Median house prices there are 618 and for Cannington and 710 for Bentley. So you look at those prices, I mean, compared to what people are spending for stuff in Armidale and Gosnells, they seem way undervalued.
Just a reminder, the information discussed in this podcast is general in nature. As we don't know your specific situation, you should always seek professional advice before taking any action. For free market reports on your suburbs of interest and other helpful resources to grow your wealth, make sure you join my property investor update at investorsedge.com.au/join. And finally, make sure you're a member of our Perth Property Investment Facebook group to be part of the conversation with other like-minded investors, get help to your questions, and get a feel for what's going on out there in the market. I'll see you in the group.